Before penicillin, before pharmaceutical labs, before the trillion-dollar drug industry existed, there was a tree. Deep in the Amazon rainforest, a bark so powerful that entire civilizations used it to fight infections, heal wounds, and survive diseases that would have wiped out modern populations. For 3,000 years it worked. Then, in the space of a single generation, it disappeared from medicine, not because it failed, but because it couldn't be patented. This is the story of Pau d'Arco. And what happened to it is one of the most deliberate erasures in the history of natural medicine. Think about what we've lost. Today, antibiotic resistance is one of the fastest-growing health crises on the planet. The World Health Organization has called it one of the greatest threats to global health. Infections that were once easily treated are becoming untreatable. And yet, in the bark of a South American tree, ancient healers had already solved this problem. Not with chemicals synthesized in a lab, not with compounds that bacteria could learn to resist, with something that grew from the earth, something that had been tested not in clinical trials, but across 3,000 years of human survival. The question isn't whether Pau d'Arco worked. The question is, why did we stop using it? Here's what most people don't know. In the 1960s, a series of studies conducted at major research institutions showed Pau d'Arco had remarkable antimicrobial properties. Hospitals in Brazil were quietly using it. Researchers were excited. Then the studies stopped. The funding dried up, and the bark that had kept the Amazon alive for millennia vanished from medical literature almost overnight. What you're about to hear isn't alternative medicine. It's buried history, and the science that modern research is only now beginning to recover. The Inca Empire didn't build the largest civilization in the Americas by accident. At its peak, the Inca controlled over 2 million square miles of territory, from the Pacific coast to the high Andes, from the equator deep into Patagonia. They fed millions, built roads without wheels, and constructed cities without iron tools. And they stayed alive using plants that modern medicine has never fully understood. Pau d'Arco, known in Quechua as Taheebo, was one of their most sacred medicines. The inner bark of the tababuia tree was scraped, boiled into a deep reddish tea, and administered for infections, fevers, inflammatory conditions, and open wounds. Inca healers called Kalawaya carried it across mountain passes and through jungle trails. It was not a remedy of last resort. It was a remedy of first response. The Kalawaya were extraordinary figures, traveling healers who memorized hundreds of plant medicines and walked thousands of miles to treat communities across the empire. Their knowledge was not written down. It was memorized, passed from master to apprentice across generations. And at the center of their pharmacopoeia, generation after generation, was Pau d'Arco. But the Inca were not the first. Archaeological evidence suggests that indigenous communities in what is now Brazil had been using tabebuia bark for over 3,000 years before the Inca Empire even existed. Cave paintings in the Amazon basin reference healing rituals involving the reddish tea. Ancient middens, refuse piles studied by archaeologists, contain traces of the bark alongside medicinal tools. 3,000 years. That's longer than the Roman Empire existed, longer than Christianity has been practiced, longer than written English has existed. When a plant survives that long in human medicine, not as a curiosity, but as a primary treatment, something in it works. In 1956, a Brazilian physician named Dr. Meyer began administering Pau d'Arco tea to cancer patients at a hospital in Santo André. What he observed and documented was remarkable. Patients reported reduced pain. Some showed unexpected recovery patterns. Word spread through the Brazilian medical community. By the early 1960s, researchers at the University of Sao Paulo and several American institutions had begun isolating the active compounds in the bark. What they found was a compound called lapachol. Lapachol is a naturally occurring naphthoquinone, a class of compound with demonstrated antimicrobial, antifungal, and anti-inflammatory properties. In laboratory settings, it showed activity against a range of bacteria, fungi, and even certain parasites. The results were significant enough that the National Cancer Institute in the United States began investigating it in the early 1970s. And here is where the story turns. Those trials showed that lapachol had measurable biological activity, but achieving therapeutic doses in humans caused side effects, including nausea and anticoagulation. The trials were discontinued. What the pharmaceutical industry never investigated, and what traditional healers had always known, was that pau d'arco bark contains not just lapachol, but over 20 active compounds that work in synergy. The Inca never isolated a single molecule. They used the whole bark, and the whole bark behaved differently. Modern researchers call this the entourage effect, the idea that plant compounds work together in ways that isolated molecules cannot replicate. But by the time this understanding emerged, funding had moved on. Patents could not be filed on a tree that grew wild across South America. And without patents, there was no profit motive to continue the research. The bark went back to the rainforest, and the pharmaceutical industry moved forward with synthetic antibiotics, compounds that bacteria, as we now know, would learn to resist. In 1981, the FDA issued a warning against pau d'arco products being sold in the United States. The warning cited insufficient evidence for medical claims. What it did not mention was the existing body of Brazilian and South American research showing real antimicrobial activity. It did not mention the 3,000 years of documented traditional use. It did not mention that the trials had been discontinued, not because the bark did not work, but because an isolated compound at high doses caused side effects. The regulatory framework that governs medicine in the United States and increasingly across the Western world is built around isolated, patentable compounds. A whole plant bark, used as a tea in the way it had been used for millennia, simply does not fit that framework. It cannot be patented. It cannot generate the billion-dollar returns that justify clinical trials. And so, it disappears. Not because it failed science, but because science, as currently structured, failed to ask the right questions about it. This is the pattern. It happened to pau d'arco. It happened to dozens of other medicinal plants across the Amazon, across Africa, across Asia. The erasure is not always deliberate. Sometimes it is simply the logic of an economic system that only funds what it can own. But the result is the same. 3,000 years of healing knowledge gone from mainstream medicine in a single generation. Pau d'arco is not lost. It still grows in the Amazon, and it is still used by indigenous communities across South America. And a quiet body of modern research, underfunded and largely unpublicized, continues to confirm what the Kalawaya healers already knew. The bark works, not as a replacement for modern medicine, not as a miracle cure. It is something humanity developed over thousands of years of lived experience and then abandoned in a few decades of commercial logic. If this vault matters to you, subscribe to Green Vault. Every week, we open another chapter of the knowledge the world tried to bury. The next vault opens soon.